Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Couch Potato Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Roby. Tonight I'm going to do an episode of The Twilight Zone. I had a good friend of mine who I haven't been able to get in here to do a podcast yet, but he suggested to me that maybe I do an episode or two of The Twilight Zone, the original black and white ones, because I like them so much and I've seen them so many times, I tend to be pretty knowledgeable on them. So I thought that I would start with one of my favorite ones. It's hard to say which one's my absolute favorite, but this is one of my favorite ones. It's called The Printer's Devil. Sometimes I like to call it the Devil's Printer because that's the way I like to pronounce it, but it's called the Printer's Devil, and it's episode 9 in season 4, I believe. And it stars, I'm going to cheat here and do a little bit of looking on Wikipedia here, but it's written by Charles Beaumont, who had a short story called The Devil You Say. And this is basically based on his short story. And just so I know I got the characters correct, I know it's Burgess Meredith. He plays Mr. Smith. Also, he slashed the devil. And Robert Sterling is Douglas Winter. And Pat Crawley is Jackie Benson, Ray Teal is Mr. Franklin, and Charles P. Thompson is Andy Praskin. And those are the main characters in there. There's some other characters, but they're minor. And basically, it's a story about a small-time paper having its troubles financially. Big papers moved in down the street or across the street or something, and basically is just running the small-time guy out of business. And Burgess Meredith's character, Mr. Smith, comes along and says that he can basically do everything that he needs. He can be a linotype operator, which I guess is the guy that sets it up for the machine to print the newspapers. And he also says that he is an excellent reporter as well. And this is news to Douglas Winter's ears because that's the two things he's really lacking. He's got a Mr. Praskins that's a pretty good linotype operator, but he don't really have a reporter. And Mr. Smith has also offered to give him money to pay his debtors so he can stay afloat and waive the salary. And so really he convinces Mr. Winter that he's got nothing to lose. And we find out later in the episode that in essence, he tells him he's the devil, and he wants his eternal soul as a trade, in which Mr. Winter actually does it because he thinks he's crazy and doesn't believe him. But he'll soon find out that Mr. Smith can kind of predict the news, make the news happen, so therefore they can get the story out first, sell more papers, and I guess this coming out when it did, I guess selling the papers is the big thing. You know, that's in essence what makes you a good paper or a bad paper, selling more papers and the other guy be out of business. So I'm going to start this. I'm watching a DVD with no commercials. And if you have a DVD with no commercials or you're streaming it online, that would be the way to do it. And I'm going to start mine. Mine says 44 seconds is where I have it paused, but I have it started right when it's getting ready to start. I've already bypassed the opening, the do-do-do-do-do-do-do. I've already bypassed all that, and I'm right here in front of the newspaper place where the big ugly station wagon and two people are walking across. So I am going to start it now, and I'm going to give commentary along. So we hope you enjoy this special edition. Okay, so like I said, there's the ugly station wagon in front of the Dan'sburg Courier. That's what it's called. Apparently this is Douglas Winter, and he's telling the debtor, I'll send you a check first thing in the morning. Now, how many of us have told somebody that? Or told a bill collector that? You know, checks in the mail, it'll be there in the morning. So I don't know if I quite believe him there. He's out of cigarettes. He throws that down. And it was obviously night, so he's having a bad, papers everywhere on his desk. He finds a bent cigarette. Now he can't find a match or a lighter, so he's having a real tough time here. His lighter's out of fluid or whatever. Leans over and dumps his chair over. So he's having a hard time. And here's Miss Benson. And she's got a lighter for him. And he's a wreck. And I guess she is his secretary, but I guess she's one of 3 employees at this point. But she also, I think, dates him as well. Here's Mr. Praskins, Andy Praskins. He's the linotype operator. I'm going to turn my volume up here to 13, lucky 13, since we are talking about the Twilight Zone, so I can hear it a little bit. So Andy wants to talk to Mr. Winter, and he's nervous, and Mr. Winter has a bottle of booze in the drawer. Every boss ought to have a big bottle of booze in the drawer. So he tells Mr. Winter he's resigning. And he's saying it's been basically 2 months since he's been paid. And Miss Benson here is like, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You know, he's went 2 months without getting paid, and he wants to put in his notice, and she's like, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Now, I'll tell you one thing. If I didn't get paid in 2 months, I wouldn't have waited 2 months. I'd have probably quit after the first paycheck, moved on. And Andy knows the story, too, because he's sitting here saying, how are you going to compete with these other guys? And they can pour tons of money on it, lose it, and still be okay. So he knows what the score is. And certainly if I would have known what the score was, probably after my first paycheck or 2 paychecks, I'd have been done for sure. No 2-week notice either. And the boss understands. It's real nice to him, and this Miss Benson's like, get out of here, Andy, get out of here, and, you know. And Andy tells him, you know, I still say you're the best. And I'm like, the best. I'm kind of thinking to myself, the best of what? You know, he's out of business. So I think it's Jackie as a secretary, but she kind of acts like she's the boss. You know, ordering the guy around. This poor guy here's at it. And I guess while they're just kind of killing time here, I'll say I hope that everyone likes this podcast show. Typically we do movies and I'll have partners. There's been a couple of movies I've done by myself. But what I hope is that everybody goes to YouTube, goes to our The Couch Potato Podcast page, and subscribes to it, hits the bell so you get the updates, and you're not going to get bombarded with updates, because typically I don't do too many of these because I just don't have the people. People want to do it, but I only got a few guys that actually commit to it. And I'm not going to do a whole lot of these myself just because I like having the camaraderie of someone else with me. But I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to our channel on YouTube and hit the bell. And if you're on Facebook, you're already a member of the Couch Potato Podcast Facebook page. And Usually I go live on that. And a week from today, this is Wednesday, a week from today, it'll be September 11th, I'll be going live on Facebook page, and we're going to do, we're not sure if we're going to do Big Trouble in Little China, or we're going to do some discussions on Friday the 13th, episodes that we've already done, on the different movies. I think we've done 1 through 5 so far. So we hope you go subscribe to that, and it helps. Just subscribing helps, and always share your link. Share our link on your Facebook page. That helps. So back to the show here. Douglas Winters looking at some different papers. These are obviously papers that he hasn't written, but probably his rival, where it's saying that the Dansburg Courier is going under. And basically it's saying what he already knows. So he's taking him another swig of the drink here, and he's riding the nice company station wagon real slow. It's obviously late at night. And he pulls up to a bridge here or an overpass, a bridge that appears to be one vehicle wide. Can't get 2 vehicles on it, so he's going to park here with his lights on, obviously drunk as a skunk now, because he's got the bottle. The bottle looks like it's empty, and he's staggering around, so he's polished off more than a half a bottle if you're watching this too. Yeah, he's got one last swig in it, and he's taking that, and I guess that'd make me upset too. I'm not a drinker of whiskey like he is, obviously, but I do like wine. Okay, so Mr. Smith just walks up here as it looks as though he was getting ready to jump off this bridge, and asks him for a light for his cigar. And Burgess Meredith just said, or Mr. Smith just said, hey, you were getting ready to commit suicide, don't you? Or wouldn't you? And he says exactly what I was thinking. He says, I think if you want to do it, that's your decision, but make a good job of it, and this looks uncertain. And I always kind of thought it didn't look very deep. The jump's only... It looks like it's 10 feet or less, and you couldn't kill yourself with that, but and of course Mr. Winter didn't have a match, because if you remember earlier, he didn't have one. And Mr. Smith is saying, would you give me a lift into town? And he don't want him to change his plans. If he wants to commit suicide, go right ahead. But if he's not going to, would he give him a lift? And he just says, hey, I found a light, and his finger's on fire, and, he's lighting his crooked cigar. So that's the first indication that he's a little more than a Mr. Smith. And of course, Mr. Winters doesn't know this yet, but Rod Serling is on here giving his pitch. So this allows me to go ahead and tell you that Mr. Winter don't actually know this yet, but Mr. Smith is going to tell him, that I come to Dansburg or wherever they're at. I come here because of you. I'm looking for you. I'm hoping you can give me a job. And it's almost like if Mr. Winter was looking for a sign or something not to jump, then this was certainly it. And of course they pull up right in front of the pub, the local watering hole. Smitty's Bar and Grill. So Mr. Smith kind of invites himself, you're not going to go in there and drink alone. And so Mr. Smith's going to give him the pitch here. And yeah, bare minimum, Mr. Smith owes him a drink or two for driving him to town.
Give me a martini, would you? Make it a double, the same.
Mr. Winter, could I see you for a second?
What about?
Well,
Oh, yes. Yes, Tab.
sorry, but Mr. Foster says if I'm not...
Mr. Foster.
Please allow me. Now, Molly, run and get those things, will you? And tell Miss Foster to make them strong. Will you do that?
So Mr. Smith basically is good to buy the drinks, and I think he's got the hots for Molly, this blonde-haired girl that's the bartender, and
My name is Douglas Winter.
or the waitress, and apparently a Mr. Foster is who owns the Smitty's Bar and Grill, and he's basically saying that Mr. Winter's tab is too high, and he's not giving him no more drinks.
You see, you are the reason that I've journeyed to Danceburg.
So Mr. Smith is telling him, "You're the reason that I'm here."
Now, the fact is, I'm a newspaper man. I was hoping to secure a position with your paper. I'm sorry. In call, I can save you a trip. Why? The courier is dead, Mr. Smith. I don't understand. I'm not too understand.
So Mr. Winters is telling Mr. Smith, "You've wasted your time coming. I'm closed, and the Gazette has taken over."
Here's my dear. In payment for your lovely smile.
Thank you, sir.
She moves fast for a big one.
Mr. Smith says she moves fast for a big one, whatever that means.
You was a good linotype operator? I doubt it. They just grabbed my best man today. Why? That's my specialty, along with the reporting. You mean you're a reporter and a linotype operator? Absolutely. If I may dispense with false modesty, I count myself among the best, both field, perhaps the best.
So Mr. Smith is telling
Say something.
Mr. Winter that he's the best linotype operator and reporter, and he considers himself the best of both fields.
Save the courier.
And he's telling Whitaker that we could save the Courier if you hire me.
I'll waive salary until you're in the black. That's crazy. I might never be in the black. It's a chance. It's better than anything you have now. Are you sure you know how to operate a linotype machine? Mr. Winter, that's like asking Paganini if he can play the fiddle.
Mr. Whitaker asked him if he could run a linotype machine, and he said that's like asking Paganini if he can play a fiddle. I'm a virtual virtuoso.
Now, Mr. Winter.
That's funny. Mr. Smith stops and takes a second look at that girl. She's probably a third of his age.
Where have you been? I've been calling your home all day.
Oh, I'm Jackie. Like to meet Mr. Smith. This is Miss Benson, my most valuable employee. Second most valuable, Mr. Winter.
Yeah, he didn't say what Jackie's position was, but he said my most valuable employee, and Mr. Smith just said second best. So he's already considered himself the best asset, and he's getting ready to show Mr. Winter that he can type up this, he can use this old rickety machine and do it pretty quick. And he's going to impress them too, because they're not going to believe how quick he can do this.
Keep it burning.
If he doesn't play Chopin's Polonaise, I'll be disappointed.
So I'm not exactly sure how this works, but it looks like you type it up, something very simpler or something similar to a typewriter maybe, and this machine puts the stuff together, the plates together, and kind of assembles it. And
I have my cigar back.
they may have sped it up when they show his fingers typing, but whatever it is, Mr. Winter, and they're pretty impressed. So
I may have to make a few modifications, but on the whole, it's in fine condition. It'll stick with that.
he's telling them he might have to make a few adjustments to it, and that's the key. That's where the trouble comes in for Mr. Winter and others. If you just heard this kick on, there's an air conditioner in here, the room where I'm broadcasting from, because this is the 3rd floor and it gets kind of hot up here, so I've got an extra unit. And Whitaker just said, I love this little quote. He goes, once he finds out that it's for real, that he did this and it's correct, he's like, Mr. Smith, why you want to work for a hick paper like this? And now he's telling them that he's a better reporter than he is a linotype operator, and some people have a green thumb and he has a green nose. He can spell the story. Excuse me. $4,851, I think, is what she said. That's what it would take to keep the paper going. And he just pulls out a wad of money that probably looks like it's $5,000. Just kind of pulls it out of his jacket and says, I could give you a loan. So in the last couple of minutes, they've been pretty sold on this guy. It's been kind of nothing but talk since the beginning, but now he's used the linotype machine and he's put together that story, and now he's got that money. So now Mr. Winters, hope I wasn't calling him Whitaker. Mr. Winters understands now that he's for real. And apparently we're projecting a little bit of a time later, and subscriptions are coming in and business is looking good. So now what's happened is, let's see, First National Bank robbed in broad daylight. And Mr. Smith here has the story already typed up, ready to go. And he's claiming that if we can beat the Gazette, which is the rivaling newspaper, if we can beat them to the story, would you be happy about that? And Mr. Winters is like, absolutely. And he called the bank to verify it. And so now he just told him, I told you I had a nose for news. So now, there goes the Danburg Courier truck riding around, or that station wagon, or somebody in the back of it throwing papers, and somebody driving it, and neither one of them was Mr. Winter or Mr. Smith. So apparently there's other people. Mr. Winters or Mr. Smith's out on the corner selling papers too, so he's a salesman, a reporter, and a linotype operator. He can do it all. So he's got another story written up here. High school principal exposed for bigamist. And Miss Benson and Mr. Winter here, I can't believe it. And unlike the Enquirer and crappy newspapers like that, they apparently verified these stories, and Miss Benson just went to check and make sure. And Mr. Winters here believes him. You got to check the story out, but he believes him because he's Yep, Miss Benson just said it. It's true. It happened. And I'm not sure if they had a midday paper or not, but they do now. And Miss Benson is showing that the subscriptions for the day paper, or the morning paper, or whatever, there's tons of new subscriptions. And now the Gazette guy, the guy that owns the Gazette, he's coming here to try to buy them out. Oh, sorry about that. I kicked the camera. So the guy that owns the Gazette, or is a big shot with the Gazette, he's coming over here to offer to buy the Courier and take it over, and then everybody can work for them. And he basically says you're having a little luck here, but your luck eventually will run out. And Mr. Winter, apparently he just loves what he does, so he's not selling. And he's young and ambitious looking, where this other guy's kind of, he's in a real nice suit, he's old, he's crusty looking, so he kind of represents the, your typical old businessman that's kind of got everything under control. And now Mr. Winter and Miss Benson here, I guess they're back over at Smitty's Bar and Grill, and they're eating something. It looks like breakfast or something. I wish I had something like that. I'm starving. So Mr. Smith shows up over here, and he's like, I got another story, another surprise. And let's see, fire destroys the Gazette building. And all of a sudden you can hear a fire truck in the background. So you can hear the fire truck in the background. But Mr. Smith's already got the story wrote up, and he's got a front page ready. And now the Gazette guy's over here accusing Mr. Winter of maybe starting the fire. And you can see Mr. Smith in the background kind of watching from a distance, because they're all starting to kind of think now that the only logical thing is that Mr. Smith might have started the fire, and that's how he knew ahead of time that that was going to happen. And he's just out there smiling because they're starting to figure it out. Drinking my diet root beer. Diet Big K root beer. Be nice to have them as a sponsor. So Ms. Benson asked Mr. Winter here, how did Mr. Smith get this story so quick and get it to print? And Mr. Winter's like, I don't know. So now he's wondering. I guess he's going to go talk to him. And ask him if he started the fire, because that's logically the only thing that could happen. Mr. Smith has told him he don't report on a story that he's not sure of, but he says that he didn't start the fire. So now the guy, he says that Andy Praskins wants his old Linotype job back, and he's thinking about hiring him and making Mr. Smith full-time reporting, and Mr. Smith don't want no part of that. He says, I made some adjustments to this machine. Don't want nobody else messing with it. And as of right now, he's doing fine doing both jobs. And occasionally out there selling papers. So Why hire another guy? Oh, there we go. Little making out there with Miss Benson and Mr. Winter. And I can't really tell. I can't really hear it that well because of this air conditioner, but Miss Benson obviously has a relationship with him, and she wants to marry him. And it seems like somewhere in here they might have already talked about it, and it might be coming up. But Mr. Winter was kind of like, once the courier takes off and is doing well, then they're supposed to get married. Right there, she just mentioned, he kind of barked at her and said, "You're sounding like a wife." And she says, "Well, I'm not your wife, and I never will be if, you keep this up." So Mr. Winter knows something's wrong, and it's starting to kind of bother him, but you don't want to argue a gift horse in the mouth, I guess. They're succeeding and staying in business, but yet he knows something's not right. And now he wants to talk to Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith's got another story cooked up. Something about somebody winning a sweepstakes. Like I said, I got the sound turned down purposely. And this DVD doesn't have subtitles, so I'm trying to keep it down and then hear it over the air conditioner. So just give me a little bit of a break here. But Mr. Winters is going in here, and he's going to verify the story. And this is really nice. He's in the office, and Mr. Smith is on the outside, and you can see Mr. Smith's reflection with a real evil look on his face in the glass. And this is where Mr. Smith kind of gives it away purposely, is whoever it was that was supposed to have won the sweepstakes, he just called and they said, "No, we didn't win it." And he's telling Mr. Smith that. Mr. Smith saying, "I didn't say he knew about it, I just said he won." And now the phone's ringing, and they've checked the mail or whatever and realized, hey, we won. So, in essence, Mr. Smith knew they were a winner before they did. And it's going to be time. Now he looks at Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith's got a look on his face, and now it's going to be time for them to sit down and have a real talk. And although it's really, really late, there's nobody else in there, he shuts the door, closes the shades, and he says, "You ought to pull out that drink you keep in there and in your drawer." Mr. Winter said, "I'm out." And he says, "You'll find a fresh bottle in there." So apparently the powers of be, he's got a bottle in the drawer. So now they're getting ready to have a serious heart-to-heart talk. So basically, Mr. Smith has told him he agrees to relinquish his immortal soul to the barrier upon his death. Couldn't read the rest of it. Basically, he wants to trade him his soul when he dies for what Mr. Smith says, "You'll be the most successful paper, in the world," or whatever. I guarantee it. So now he's laughing, and Mr. Smith's laughing, and he says, "You're crazy." And now they're talking about the devil. And Mr. Smith says, "The devil don't exist." And he says, "But let's just assume I'm crazy." He says, "Won't you just kind of play along with a crazy old man and sign it. Because if anyone watching has seen my podcast on the 1979 movie Salem's Lot about vampires, we talked about how in order for a vampire to come in and get you, at least vampires don't exist, but in the movies and going back to the beginning, the vampire has to kind of be invited in. You have to invite him in. And, with mythology, with devils and stuff like that, the devil's kind of the same way. He has to kind of be invited in. So by Mr. Smith getting him to sign this paper, he's basically inviting him in. And so now, basically, Mr. Smith has finagled his way around where he's sitting in the chair behind the desk and Mr. Winters is walking around. And I guess the whole thing is you're supposed to know that basically he's very manipulating. And the ultimate manipulation be get him to sign this contract. And they're sitting here drinking away at that bottle. And he's saying, won't you just humor an old man and sign it? And he basically keeps telling him, the devil don't exist, so won't you just humor an old man and sign it? What's it going to hurt? And he says, imagine that, a grown man believing in the devil. So Mr. Winters now grabs it out of his hand and signs it. And if you're a fan of these old Twilight Zones like I am, you'll know that I can't tell you how many he played in exactly, but Burgess Meredith played in several. And he's good in every one of them. So what we got now is, I guess they're showing you over time, they're showing where stories are being written and you're seeing disasters happening. Yeah. She pulls a thing of coffee out of a paper bag, and it looks like a quart, or a pint, rather, like a pint of ice cream or something.
What is going on? What is the matter? Why these papers were on the newsstand less than an hour when this happened. Who's the real with them?
So basically, Mr. Winter is seeing this same thing happen. These papers were out on the stand. Miss Benson said that this story that went out, the papers were out on the stand being sold less than an hour after this event happened, which was this big building collapsing.
What do you want? Fire.
I think he just referred to the match or something as a spot of fire.
You and I are going to be great friends.
And what's kind of funny is everybody that uses matches, they light their cigar or whatever, and then they put it out, but then they just pitch it in the floor. And I don't know. Don't think that's real smart. But again, it's showing over time. It's showing Mr. Smith typing at the line of type, and then all these disasters happening. And people selling papers, and there's a sign there that said "Get it first" from the Danburg Courier. Boy, that's that couldn't be no more truth. Couldn't be no more truthful.
You've got to fire him. Why now? You paid back the loan. You don't owe him.
I know, but I can't. That's all. Believe me, I can't.
Why? Just kick him out.
What's wrong?
And so Douglas Winter here is he's in a situation where the heat's on, because apparently the time it takes to get the story out on a paper where people can purchase it, the time is getting less and less and less, and everybody knows that something's wrong, including Mr. Winter, because now he has to believe that maybe the devil story really is true, that maybe he can write a story and then make the story happen. So, and he's convinced that he can't fire Mr. Smith.
Mind your own business.
And now Miss Benson's quitting over it.
Connected with the courier.
I am no longer connected with the courier. Smith.
I want you to reconsider. The fact is, I've developed a very special fondness for you.
Please get out of my way.
Wow. He whispered something in Miss Benson's ear to try to get her to stay, and she slapped him pretty hard, and he said, "You'll be sorry that you done that."
As long as it's labor lost, it's gone, vanished. Don't worry. Do without her.
Yeah, Mr. Smith's basically a one-man band. He don't really even need Mr. Winter.
The person we can do without is you. That's an ungrateful thing to say to a friend who pulled you out of bankruptcy. Turned the Courier into the hottest journal in the state. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Smith. It's not worth it. I had a nightmare.
So now Mr. Winter is confronting him.
Cause terrible things to happen so I could get scoops for my paper. Well, I'm awake now, and I want you out of here. Not so fast. What about our contract? What about our contract? You said you'd do anything to make your paper a success. I heard you. That's why I came. Well, I've carried out my part. You are a success. If you're not a nightmare, then you're something even worse. Because somehow you make these things happen. You caused tragedy. You destroyed life and property. I didn't bargain for this. Oh, yes, you did. But you put it out of your mind. You thought you'd get everything for nothing. That's not the way life works.
It's kind of how people are nowadays.
Well, don't worry about it.
Mr. Smith said you wanted to be the best, and I held up my end of the bargain, and he says you want everything for free and don't want to pay nothing in return. Life don't work that way. Be nice if there's a big segment of our society that would believe that. That would be nice.
I suppose that means you can't take my immortal soul while I'm alive and walking around. Is that it? Something like that.
So basically,
There's old nose. Smell the story coming in.
so he's basically told Mr. Winter that he can't take a soul while he's alive. If he wants to basically commit suicide, he can get out of the contract with him. And Mr. Winters basically told him no, and he kind of points at his nose and says, "This old nose smells a story coming in." So he went over here and typed it up, and now Mr. Winters reading it. And the story basically is that Miss Winters gets into a wreck, and she's killed.
The accident took place on Bascom Road. That won't stop it. Still think I'm a nightmare, do you? Change it. I can't change it. The little modifications I made altered this machine quite a bit. Whatever it writes comes to pass.
So now he's told Mr. Winter that don't matter if he throws the
Destroy her for that?
whatever it is that they set up in order to do it. He threw it across the room, and Mr. Smith, well, now we can call him the devil. The devil's told Mr. Winter that it doesn't matter if he throws it away because whatever he's done to the machine, once the machine gets the story, then it will come to pass.
Died of her injury. Not yet. I can add a few lines either way. Whether she lives or dies.
So now the devil's telling him that he said that she died from the injuries, and it's all up to him whether that happens or not. He told him that he can add a few words either way, and he hands him a gun, and Mr. Winters took 3 shots at the devil, and he basically tells him, you got 3 shots left.
Where are you going? There's got to be some way to stop you, and I'm going to find it. That's the spirit. Never give up. But remember, you only have 1 hour and 15 minutes.
He's got 1 hour and 15 minutes, and he's leaving, and the devil says, where are you going? And he said, I'm going to stop you somehow. And he's like, that's a spirit, never give up.
Jackie! You want to make up the whole building?
I always like my evil people, whether they're villains in a movie or a show or something. I always like my villains to kind of have a sense of humor about them. So whatever happened, Miss Benson's come back to talk to Mr. Smith.
I want to ask something of you.
Might that be?
I want you to go away. Now, I know you've done a great deal for the paper. We appreciate that. But I love Doug. I want to marry him. But the way he's been acting ever since you came, I don't even recognize him anymore. He's a different person.
I think that's due to my influence.
So basically, she's asked Mr. Smith to leave, and she's told him, I love Doug, I want to marry him, and you're the reason that he's changed. And whatever the case is, Mr. Smith here's agreed to it. He said, I don't want to stay where I'm not wanted, so... His only request is that she drive him somewhere, give him a ride. And I think he's going to be the one driving, actually. But he's like, I'll gladly leave. I just need a ride out of here. So he picked the gun up off the floor and laid it on the table here. So we've got, I don't know, maybe 25 minutes before the story, before the time and the story kind of meets. Or I guess the timeline that I'm saying, and he just said we'll go by Baskin Roads, and that's the road that he wrote up in the story. So in essence, he's going to drive.
Miss Benson, no, she's Mrs. Ronstadt. What's the matter, Mr. Winter? What can I get you something?
So Mr. Winters has went to her apartment. She's not there. He went back to Smitty's Bar and Grill, and Molly's there, and she's not there. So now they're going down Baskin Road. And just as Mr. Smith said, here's a guy driving the opposite way. He's got skis on top of him, so he's obviously coming back from the ski trip that Mr. Smith had mentioned. So Mr. Winters goes back to the paper. I mean, he's trying to find out a way, and I guess he's trying to find Miss Benson, but he went from the paper to her apartment to the bar, now back to the paper, and speedometer says, it said 70 miles per hour. He's picking up speed, of course. They're in a convertible, and this other guy's like in a like a Woody or a station wagon or something. So now Mr. Winters is going to turn on the linotype here, and I guess he is going to change a few words either way, like Mr. Smith said that he could. It looks like we got 5 minutes till the deadline. So whatever he's doing, he's got to come up with something quick. And keep in mind too that Mr. Winters now knows how this whole thing is set up. Miss Benson does not. She doesn't really know nothing, where Mr. Winter knows that in fact he is the devil and that he's made this stuff happen by modifying the machine. I guess note the title of it is Printer's Devil. I was wanting to say Devil's Printer again, because basically if it's printing off the story, it is the printer's devil, but it's called Devil's Printer, I think. So you got 3 minutes roughly. Looks like Mr. Winters is pretty good on that machine himself. And they keep showing the guy. Obviously the guy's wanting to fall asleep at the wheel. We got about 1.5 minutes now, according to the clock that they're showing up here. And now they're getting ready to meet at the fork in the road. They collide. Doesn't look like a whole lot of trouble to his car, and that ain't a Woody or a station wagon, it's just an old car. So Miss Benson kind of got knocked a little loopy, but she's alive and looks well. And Mr. Smith is gone. And she comes running into the paper, so she's obviously fine. She looks a little bit like Mary Tyler Moore on the Dick Van Dyke Show a little bit. Kind of like a poor man's Mary Tyler Moore.
Listen to this. Mr. Smith, former star reporter and chief linotype operator for the Courier, resigned his position and left Dan Strickler's home at 11:29 this evening. His contract with Mr. Douglas Winter was declared null and void owing to Mr. Winter's incomplete understanding of the terms of the document. It means that he's gone. And he won't be...
So he never really does tell her, but he just read this story where he basically took himself out of the contract and had Mr. Smith resign 1 minute before the deadline was to happen. So she basically don't have a scratch on her. Don't look like she's hurt at all. And the cars didn't look messed up either. So maybe redoing this story did that, where nobody's hurt at all. So now Rod Serling's giving his story, and knowing that the machine was old to begin with and that Mr. Smith had tampered with it, they're showing two guys moving the machine out, and I guess they're going to put a newer machine in and bring Andy Praskins back, do it the right way. But apparently that's it. That's the end of the Printer's Devil, and I guess that's the end of this one. Like I said, this is a special edition. Typically we don't do episodes of TV shows, although we wanted to do it. But a friend of mine suggested that I do Twilight Zone, and I'll probably do a couple more. Whether I'll put them on video or not, I don't know. But again, I would like to encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube page, the Couch Potato Podcast. Subscribe to it. And if you can find us on Facebook, if you're not already there, find the Couch Potato Podcast Show on Facebook. And when I do go live, you'll be available to see me live. Ironically, they're more popular when I'm not on camera. At first, we thought seeing me would be better, but we've realized that actually seeing me is not as good as just listening to me. So I don't know if it's the hair or what, but want to thank everybody for tuning in, and thank you for hopefully subscribing. This is the Couch Potato Podcast.